Multiculturalism is a concept that I've always had a bit of trouble with. I take the view that if people want to emigrate to a country, it's on the basis that they adopt the values and the practices and the standards of that country, and in return they're entitled to have the host citizenry respect their culture without trying to create some kind of federation of tribes and cultures. And I think one of the problems with multiculturalism is that we try too hard to institutionalise difference.
John Howard recently made some quote-unquote controversial comments about multiculturalism at an event hosted by the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. Certain sections of the media, for example The Guardian, have not been particularly kind to him. However, other parts of the media have been a little bit more friendly. So let's unpack what John Howard was saying and see whether or not he has a point. And let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Now, the first thing to note is John Howard should have phrased his language better. He should have known better than to phrase his statements in such a declaratory manner, using such value-laden words. He should have known the headlines that it would generate if he said that he had a problem with multiculturalism. Clearly, people are going to take that phrase and run with it. The word multiculturalism is value-laden. This was always going to erupt into a mini controversy. Therefore, even if someone agreed with John Howard's underlying point, but has a different conception of what multiculturalism or Australian values are, it is going to generate backlash. It should have used more precise language to describe the issue, even if that language is more boring and captures fewer headlines. But it then leads to the question of what exactly is John Howard saying? Well, he appears to state that he welcomes immigration. However, immigrants must adhere to a core set of values, so to speak, rather than operating as disparate, disconnected subcultures. So there's a couple of points there. One about values, and then two operating as disparate subcultures. Now, superficially, we might see where John Howard is coming from. If people immigrate, they must accept Australia's legal system, and the fact that it applies to them, for example. Further, people can't engage in cultural practices that are clearly illegal and expect the legal system to change to accommodate those practices. People might also risk opprobrium if they engage in cultural practices that seriously violate established norms. So to give you an example, there's controversy surrounding female genital mutilation. Such a practice is clearly tantamount to intentionally inflicting grievous bodily harm, something that would carry many years in prison in all Australian jurisdictions. Perhaps a less overt example is the crowds chanting, quote, "Gas the Jews" at a recent pro-Palestine rally. This could violate the somewhat maligned hate speech prohibitions. However, these prohibitions themselves have had issues and highlight the problem of competing values of preventing hate speech, so to speak, with competing values of freedom of speech. Nevertheless, we can think about some clear examples where the vast majority of people regard that thing as clearly wrong. John Howard's assertions appear unremarkable when we consider those extreme situations. However, they run into issues in grey areas. There's no clear definition of what is an Australian value, or what Australian values entail, what they entail in day-to-day practice or entail more normatively. For example, the ALP and the Coalition differ significantly in their core values. The ALP wants more state power, more control over individuals' finances, and higher taxes. They would regard that as a core Australian value. The Coalition, by contrast, wants to stand for greater liberty, less state intervention, and more financial individual freedom. They would regard that as a core Australian value. However, these values are in clear opposition. The two parties are clearly at loggerheads about what they think are clear core values. Therefore, any assertion that people have to adhere to a core set of Australian values begs the underlying question of what exactly are those values? And further, how do you reconcile competing values? Now, John Howard also may or may not have been referring to immigrants living in national communities. For example, people from China living predominantly in specific areas. However, to some extent, this is a little unsurprising given the actual practicality. People are always going to move closer to those people with whom they have the most in common, with whom they might have networks, with whom they can communicate a little bit more easily. Immigrants might also fear racism, because if you were moving into another country, a country that perhaps is speaking a different language predominantly, you might wonder whether that country might be slightly racist towards you when you were immigrating into that country. And therefore people might stick more in a national group, perhaps out of fear of that racism and out of a need for potential protection. And therefore, if that's the concern, it's incumbent upon Australia to make sure that it is welcoming to people from different backgrounds, and to ensure that things like racism simply aren't tolerated. In this context, some people also seem to refer to migrant communities functioning in their own native language. We've seen some headlines about this from certain sections of the media, where they might go to a set of shops and remark that all of the signs in that set of shops are in a particular language, and that language is not English. However, again, that's perhaps a missed opportunity, both for the person to some extent, but more importantly for Australia. Practically both parties would benefit from enhanced language skills and greater cross-cultural communication. After all, if Australia is worried about productivity, then having people who are bilingual or multilingual is going to enhance that productivity. Australia needs to be more welcoming to people who are speaking multiple languages, and perhaps to enable them to function more easily in English. Now, of course, there are some costs that people face when doing this. It's actually not easy, nor is it cheap, for someone to learn English. And if Australia is serious about encouraging English adoption, then it needs to make good quality English courses more readily available and more financially viable. It could do this, for example, through tax deductions or tax credits for taking those courses. This would also clearly increase productivity, which, like I've said, is essential given Australia's high inflation. And therefore Australia might benefit from providing additional opportunities to migrants. But in any case, we have that underlying normative issue. Is it an Australian value to force someone to speak a particular language, or to live in a particular area, or to communicate in English? Does Australia want to be that type of dictatorial country that forces those types of things on a person? Or is individual liberty a more important value? If someone believes in that integration, but also in freedom, how do those values actually reconcile? We run into issues of competing values, which is something that France has been grappling with in recent times, for example. It's not an easy issue to resolve. Some Australians might be concerned that migrants might bring bad policies with them, and advocate for those policies and change things in a way that they regard as being worse. In this case, the resistance to the immigration is more a resistance to a specific policy platform rather than immigration per se. There might be concerns, for example, about bad taxation policies coming out of Scandinavia. But not every Scandinavian actually believes in those policies or would support them or would advocate for them. And therefore it is very difficult to actually make a rule in relation to this. And I personally don't want to be saddled with bad fiscal policies dredged out of 1960s socialist hellscapes. However, we can't tear all people from a particular location with the same brush. People need to be considered on their own individual merits, and it is very difficult to phrase a policy around whether or not a person holds a particular value judgment, because different people believe different things are differently important. This is the case even within national borders, for example. In the United States, people are leaving California for Texas and for Florida. This is on the back of failed policies within California, which include high taxes and high crime. There is a concern, of course, that these former Californians will bring their bad policies with them to their new homes in Texas and Florida, making those places worse for existing residents. And therefore, there's a little bit of a backlash against some Californian immigration within the United States. And we can see this play out also at a national level. But there's not an easy resolution, because not everyone agrees on a core set of values, including whether those values should even come into play at all in the immigration context. And herein lies the problem. What are those Australian values towards which John Howard wants people to adhere? And what happens when those values conflict? Whose values are they? How are they enforced? How are they applied? How do they change over time? We don't have easy answers to this. And this is where John Howard's comments fall a little bit short. And therefore, when we start dissecting John Howard's statements, they start to have some issues. And John Howard should have been more precise and perhaps a little bit more measured in his comments. But do let me know your thoughts about what John Howard is saying in the comments below. I'd be keen to hear what you think, including, and perhaps especially, if you disagree with what I'm saying. But otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.